The key felt cold in Alex's palm, a small, insignificant piece of brass against his skin. It was the only thing Isabella had left him. Well, that, and the echoing silence of their once shared apartment, now stripped bare of anything valuable. The ghost marks on the walls where paintings used to hang were like pale scars, reminders of a life that had been systematically amputated. She had stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the harsh afternoon light, a vision of cruel victory. Her laughter, sharp and metallic, had ricocheted off the empty walls. "Enjoy the memories, darling," she had sneered, her voice dripping with a venom that had taken him 10 years to fully comprehend. "They're all you have left." Her brother Julian had been lurking behind her, a smug grin plastered on his face. He held a velvet box that contained the last of her jewelry, another asset liquidated, another piece of their life converted into currency for her new one. Isabella had tossed the key onto the floor. It had skittered across the hardwood, coming to rest near his worn-out work boots. It was a gesture of profound contempt. "I almost forgot," she said, the performance of it all making Alex's stomach turn. "Your inheritance, the key to that dreadful, dusty old storage unit your grandfather left you. You can keep it. I wouldn't want to deprive you of all your worldly possessions." Julian had snickered, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Yeah, Alex, all that priceless junk. Maybe you can build a fort out of old newspapers." The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot spike driving through his chest. He had remained silent, a statue of defeat, because he knew any word he uttered would only fuel their sadistic pleasure. He had learned long ago that his silence was his only shield against their particular brand of cruelty. She had surveyed the empty room one last time, her eyes scanning for any forgotten treasure. Finding none, she gave a satisfied nod. The cars were gone. The joint bank account, which held the entirety of his life's savings, was drained. The furniture, the art, the life they had supposedly built together, it was all gone. "Don't try to contact me," she had commanded, her final edict. "My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce. It should be simple. I've taken what's mine. You're left with, well, this." She gestured vaguely at the empty space, at him, as if he were just another fixture she had chosen to discard. Then they were gone. The front door clicked shut with a finality that felt like a gunshot in the cavernous silence. Alex had stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of his own breathing. He slowly bent down, his back aching with a weariness that went far beyond the physical. He picked up the small brass key. It was old, the kind with a circular head and a simple, jagged tooth. On the tarnished brass, a small tag was attached with a thin wire. It read, "Unit 17. He closed his fist around it, the metal edges digging into his skin. This was it. This was the sum total of his 10-year marriage. A punchline to a joke he had never understood, he was the butt of. The storage unit. He hadn't thought about it in years. His grandfather, a quiet, methodical man, had left it to him in his will. "There are things in there that matter, Alex," he had said, his voice raspy in his final days. "Not for their price, but for their story. Don't let anyone tell you they're just junk." Isabella had always dismissed it. "An old man's hoard," she called it. "Probably full of moth-eaten clothes and rusty tools. We should have cleared it out and sold it all for scrap years ago." He had resisted, not out of any great conviction, but out of a quiet sense of duty to his grandfather's memory. It was one of the few battles he had ever won against her, and only because the matter was too trivial for her to expend any real energy on. Now, in the wreckage of his life, this key was the only thing he truly owned, a symbol of his failure tossed at his feet like a bone to a dog. The silence in the apartment pressed in on him. He walked through the rooms, his footsteps echoing like a stranger's in a foreign place. The bedroom was the worst. The indentation of her head was still faintly visible on the pillow she'd left behind. The closet was a hollow cavern, smelling faintly of her expensive perfume. He sank onto the bare mattress, the springs creaking like an old church door. The weight of the last decade settled on his shoulders, a crushing burden of memory and regret. He had worked so hard. He had poured every ounce of his energy into his construction business, building it from the ground up. He worked long hours, his hands calloused and his body tired, all to provide Isabella with the life she claimed she deserved. She had never seen his work as a source of pride. To her, it was merely a means to an end. His sweat and sacrifice were converted into designer shoes, luxury vacations, and extravagant parties designed to impress people neither of them truly liked. He was the engine, hidden away in the grimy machine room, while she was the glamorous captain on the deck, taking all the credit for the journey. Fragfat. Her condescension had been a slow-acting poison. It started with small jibes about the dirt under his fingernails when he came home from a sight. It grew into open mockery of his simple tastes, his preference for a quiet evening at home over a loud, crowded gala. "You have no ambition, Alex," she would say, sighing dramatically. "You're content to play in the mud with your little projects. Don't you want more? Don't you want to be someone?" To him, building things was being someone. Creating a home from a blueprint, a structure from a foundation that was real. It was tangible. But in her world, value was measured only by price tags and social media posts. Her brother Julian had been her willing accomplice, a parasite who attached himself to their life and amplified Isabella's worst instinct. He was a man who had never worked an honest day, flitting from one failed venture to another, always with his hand out. He saw Alex not as a brother-in-law, but as a walking, talking wallet. Julian was the one who encouraged her spending, who whispered in her ear that she deserved better, that Alex was holding her back. He was the serpent in their already blighted garden. Alex remembered a specific anniversary, their 7th. He had saved for months to buy her a delicate vintage locket he knew she'd admired in an antique shop. He had imagined her delight, a rare moment of genuine connection. When he gave it to her, she had held it in her palm for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Then she had smiled, a thin, brittle thing. "It's quaint, Alex, thank you." The next day, Julian had remarked, loud enough for Alex to hear, "Did you see that old thing he got her? Looks like something he dug up. Isabella needs diamonds, not dust." She had worn it once, to appease him, and then it had vanished into her overflowing jewelry box, never to be seen again. A week later, she bought herself a diamond tennis bracelet, charging it to their joint account without a word to him. The message was clear, his efforts were quaint. Her desires were non-negotiable. The pain of these memories was sharp, a fresh wound for every instance of dismissal, every casual cruelty. He had endured it all, telling himself it was the price of peace, that this was just how she was. He had loved her, or at least, he had loved the woman he thought she was in the beginning, before the mask of glamour had hardened into her true face. He pushed himself off the bed. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the empty floor. He couldn't stay here. The emptiness was too loud. He looked down at the key still clutched in his hand. Unit 17. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Things in there that matter. What could possibly matter now? What pile of old junk could fill the void that had been carved out of his life? It was a fool's errand, a trip to a mausoleum of forgotten things. but it was better than staying here in the tomb of his marriage. He found his worn leather jacket, the only one she hadn't deemed worthy of being packed or thrown away. He slipped it on, the familiar weight a small comfort. He grabbed his truck keys from the otherwise empty bowl by the door and walked out, not bothering to look back. The drive to the storage facility was a blur of traffic and grey cityscapes. His mind was a maelstrom of anger and sorrow. He had been a fool, a blind, patient fool. He had mistaken her tolerance for affection, her demands for partnership. He had built her a pedestal, and she had used it as a platform from which to look down on him before kicking it out from under him. And the money, all of it, years of careful saving, of reinvesting profits from his business, of planning for a future she had apparently been planning to live without him. He had checked the account that morning. A zero balance, a single, massive wire transfer made 2 days prior to an account he didn't recognize. She had been methodical. She had been planning this for months. The storage facility was on the industrial edge of town, a place of concrete and corrugated metal. It was called Sentinel Storage, a grid of identical garage-style doors under the hum of fluorescent lights. It smelled of dust and damp concrete. He found Unit 17 at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The door was a faded, rusty red, with a heavy-duty padlock that looked as ancient as the key in his hand. For a moment he hesitated. Was he ready for this? Was he ready to face another pile of disappointments? He took a deep breath. He had nothing left to lose. The key slid into the lock with a gritty protest. It took some effort, a hard twist that made his knuckles ache, but finally the lock clicked open with a satisfying thud. He pulled it free and slid the heavy metal latch to the side. With a groan of rusted rollers, he heaved the corrugated door upward. A wave of stale, musty air washed over him. The inside of the unit was dark, and the single bare bulb overhead cast a weak, yellowy light that did little to pierce the gloom. Julian's words came back to him. Priceless junk. At first glance he was right. The unit was packed, floor to ceiling, with shapes shrouded in dusty canvas tarps. There were old wooden crates, stacks of yellowed newspapers tied with twine, and the distinct outline of what looked like old furniture. It was exactly the kind of forgotten attic his grandfather would have kept. A sense of deflation washed over Alex. Of course, what had he expected? A hidden treasure, a secret fortune that would solve all his problems? That only happened in movies. This was his reality, a 10 by 20 foot box of his dead grandfather's clutter. Still, he had come this far. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on the dusty concrete floor. He pulled at the corner of the nearest tarp. It was heavy, stiff with age. With a grunt, he pulled it back, unleashing a cloud of dust that made him cough. Underneath was a large wooden workbench, scarred with the marks of a lifetime of use. On it sat a collection of old tools, each one resting in its designated spot. There were hand planes, chisels, and saws, all meticulously maintained, their steel gleaming faintly in the dim light. His grandfather had been a cabinet maker by trade, a man who believed in the integrity of a well-made thing. Alex ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of the workbench. A pang of nostalgia hit him. He had spent hours here as a boy, watching his grandfather work, the smell of sawdust and wood varnish filling the air. These weren't just tools, they were an extension of the man he had been. He moved deeper into the unit, navigating the narrow pathways between the shrouded objects. He opened one of the wooden crates. It was filled with books, old, leather-bound volumes on engineering, architecture, and automotive design. His grandfather had been a voracious reader, a self-educated man with a boundless curiosity. He found another crate filled with meticulously organized blueprints and schematics, all drawn by hand, with a draftsman's precision. They were designs for furniture, for small inventions, for cars. That was odd. Alex knew his grandfather had liked cars, had always driven a simple, reliable sedan, but this was an obsession. There were dozens of detailed drawings, cross-sections of engines, and elegant renderings of chassis designs. He continued his exploration, a growing sense of curiosity overriding his disappointment. There was a story here, his grandfather's story. It wasn't a treasure, but it was something. It was a connection to a past that felt more real and honest than the life he had just lost. He reached the back of the unit. Against the rear wall stood a large, imposing object covered by an enormous, heavy-duty canvas tarp. It was much larger than the other items, taking up nearly a third of the space. It had the distinct shape of a vehicle. He supposed it was his grandfather's old car, stored away after he passed. He grabbed the edge of the tarp and pulled. It didn't budge. It was tied down. He fumbled in the dim light, finding a series of ropes knotted tightly to hooks on the floor. He worked at the knots, his fingers stiff and clumsy. Finally, the last one came free. He took a deep breath and gave the tarp a mighty heave. It slid away, revealing not a simple sedan, but the impossibly sleek, curved lines of a classic sports car. Its body was a deep, lustrous black, and even under a thick layer of dust, the paintwork seemed to glow. It was a 1961 Jaguar E-Type, a car he had only ever seen in magazines. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of automotive design. Alex stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out a trembling hand and wiped away some of the dust from the hood. The paint beneath was flawless, as if it had just rolled off the factory line. This wasn't junk. This was breathtaking. His eyes scanned the rest of the unit, now seeing the shapes under the other tarps with a new understanding. They weren't furniture, they were cars, all of them. He scrambled to the next shape, tearing away the tarp with a frantic energy. Underneath sat a 1957 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, its iconic doors pointing towards the ceiling like silver wings. It was in pristine condition. He moved to the next and the next, a 1967 Shelby GT 500, a 1955 Porsche 356 Speedster, an Aston Martin DB5, the same model made famous by James Bond. It was a collection, a museum-quality collection of some of the most beautiful and sought-after classic cars in the world, all hidden away in a dusty, forgotten storage unit. He leaned against the cold metal wall, his legs suddenly weak. He felt dizzy, a strange mix of disbelief and dawning comprehension swirling in his head. His grandfather, the quiet, humble cabinet maker. He had been living a secret life. He had been a collector, a connoisseur of automotive art. Alex's gaze fell upon the workbench again. His eyes landed on a small, locked metal box tucked away on a lower shelf. He hadn't noticed it before. He searched the workbench and found a small key taped to the underside of a drawer. It fit the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a leather-bound ledger and a thick stack of documents. He opened the ledger. The first page was dated nearly 50 years ago. In his grandfather's neat, precise handwriting, he had catalogued every vehicle. There were purchase dates, acquisition costs, notes on restoration work, and details Alex didn't even understand. He flipped through the pages, his astonishment growing with each entry. There weren't just the 5 cars in this unit. The ledger listed over a dozen. Where were the others? His question was answered by a note tucked into the back of the ledger. "Alex," it began, and the sight of his own name in that familiar script made his throat tighten. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found my little hobby. I hope it brings you some joy. I kept them hidden because the world is full of people who see only price tags, not passion. They would not have understood." Alex felt a lump form in his throat. Isabella? His grandfather had known somehow the kind of person she was. The note continued. "This unit is just the showroom. The real workshop is behind the back wall. Use the key from the ledger. The mechanism is behind the loose panel to the left of the workbench. Be careful, and remember, the value of a thing is not what someone will pay for it, but the story it tells and the joy it brings. Your loving grandfather, Thomas." Attached to the inside cover of the ledger was another key, this one heavy and ornate. The back wall, a false wall. He moved to the workbench, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt along the corrugated metal wall to the left, his fingers searching for a loose panel. He found it. A section of the wall, cleverly disguised, gave way under his touch, revealing a small, recessed keyhole. With a hand that shook so much he could barely guide it, he inserted the ornate key and turned. There was a low, whirring sound, the sound of a well-oiled motor coming to life. A deep, resonant click echoed in the small space, and then, impossibly, the entire back wall of the storage unit began to slide sideways, retracting smoothly into the adjoining unit. A wave of clean, climate-controlled air washed over him, a stark contrast to the musty air of the front unit. Lights flickered on automatically, bathing a vast, hidden space in bright, clear light. Alex stepped through the opening, his jaw slack with awe. He was standing in a massive underground garage. It was more like a private museum than a workshop. The floor was polished concrete, the walls were lined with professional-grade tools and equipment, and parked in neat, orderly rows were the rest of the cars from the ledger: a Ferrari 250 GTO, a Lamborghini Miura, a Bugatti Type 57, cars that were not just rare but legendary. Each one was a multi-million-dollar piece of automotive history. He walked slowly through the space, his footsteps the only sound. He was in a secret world, a cathedral of chrome and steel, built by a man he thought he knew. He finally understood. His grandfather hadn't just been a cabinet maker. He had been an investor, a brilliant and patient one. He had bought these cars decades ago when they were just old sports cars, not priceless artifacts. He had restored them himself with the same love and precision he applied to his woodwork. Alex went back to the metal box and pulled out the stack of documents. They were titles, insurance policies, and appraisal reports from a respected firm. He scanned the most recent appraisal, dated just 6 months before his grandfather passed away. He read the final number at the bottom of the page, and the air left his lungs in a rush. He had to read it again to be sure. Total appraised value, $4,200,000. $4.2 million. He sank onto an old stool, the papers trembling in his hand. The key Isabella had thrown at his feet, the key to a dreadful, dusty old storage unit, was the key to a fortune. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost suffocating. She had spent a decade mocking his simple life, his lack of ambition, while he was, unknowingly, the heir to a treasure she couldn't even comprehend. She had stripped their life bare in her hunt for status and wealth, and in her arrogance she had literally thrown away the key to more money than she had ever dreamed of. A slow, cold anger began to replace his shock. An anger that had been simmering under the surface for 10 long years. He had been a good husband. He had been patient and kind and forgiving. He had absorbed her insults and her condescension, all for the sake of a marriage she had treated like a business transaction. She had taken his life's savings, every penny he had earned, with his own 2 hands. She had left him with nothing but an empty apartment and a mocking laugh. But she had made a mistake, a devastating, catastrophic mistake. She thought he was worthless junk, just like she thought his inheritance was worthless junk. A new feeling began to crystallize in his chest, hard and sharp. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was resolve. He was not going to let her get away with this. He thought about her sneering face, the smug look in Julian's eyes. They were probably out celebrating right now, drinking champagne bought with his money, laughing about the poor, pathetic fool they had left behind. They had no idea what they had done. They had no idea what he had just found. He looked around the magnificent garage at the legacy of passion and patience his grandfather had built. This wasn't just about the money. It was about respect. It was about justice. For the first time in a decade, Alex felt a surge of power. He was no longer the victim. He was no longer the punchline. The game had changed. And Isabella didn't even know she was playing. The next morning, Alex didn't go to his construction site. Instead, he went to see Arthur Davies, his grandfather's old friend, and estate lawyer. Arthur was a sharp, semi-retired man in his late 70s, with eyes that missed nothing. Alex laid the ledger and the appraisal documents on Arthur's vast mahogany desk. He told him everything. About Isabella, the empty apartment, the drained bank account, and the discovery in the storage unit. Arthur listened patiently, his fingertips steepled under his chin. He showed no surprise, only a deep, thoughtful concentration. When Alex finished, the old lawyer slowly put on his reading glasses and began to meticulously examine the documents. The silence in the office stretched on for nearly 20 minutes, broken only by the rustle of paper. Finally Arthur looked up, a grim but determined smile playing on his lips. "Well, Alex," he said, his voice a low rumble, "your grandfather was an even smarter man than I gave him credit for, and your wife, she is an exceptionally greedy and foolish woman." "What do I do, Arthur?" Alex asked, his voice raw. "First," Arthur said, tapping a thick file folder that Alex recognized as his grandfather's will, "we establish the legal facts. This entire collection, the storage unit and the hidden garage, are all part of a premarital trust Thomas set up for you. It was designed to be your sole and separate property, completely firewalled from any community property in a marriage. Isabella has absolutely no claim to it. She never did." A wave of relief washed over Alex. "Second," Arthur continued, his eyes hardening, "we address what she did. Draining a joint account in that manner just before filing for divorce is not just unethical. It's a form of fraud. It's called dissipation of marital assets. And the courts take a very, very dim view of it." Arthur leaned forward, his expression turning predatory. "She thinks she's won. She's currently living off stolen money. Our strategy will be simple, and it will be surgical. We do nothing, for now." Alex frowned. "Nothing? But she has all my money." "Precisely," Arthur said with a cunning glint in his eye. "Let her spend it. Let her and that leech of a brother of hers go on a spree. Let them buy new cars, new clothes, put down a deposit on a new apartment. Every receipt, every credit card statement will be another nail in her coffin." He explained the plan. They would let Isabella file for divorce first. In her filing, she would declare her assets and liabilities, and she would undoubtedly lie, claiming the money she took was rightfully hers, or part of a separation agreement that never existed. "She will build our case for us," Arthur explained. "She will perjure herself. Meanwhile, we will be gathering evidence, bank statements, records of her expenditures. We will let her dig a hole so deep she'll never be able to climb out." "And then?" Alex asked. "And then," Arthur said, a chilling finality in his tone. "At the preliminary hearing, we present our evidence. We reveal the existence of the trust she knew nothing about. We reveal her fraudulent transfer of funds. We will petition the judge to freeze all her assets immediately. We will demand she pay back every single cent she stole, and we will ask for her to be held liable for all legal fees given her malicious conduct." It was a devastatingly simple plan. It used her own arrogance and greed as the weapon against her. "She left you with a key," Arthur mused, picking up the old brass key from his desk. "She thought she was leaving you with trash. It's poetic, really. This key will not only unlock your future, Alex, it will be the key that locks the door to hers." A cold sense of calm settled over Alex. This was the path. Not loud, explosive revenge, but a quiet, methodical dismantling of the life she had stolen from him. It was a plan his grandfather would have appreciated. The next few weeks were the hardest of Alex's life. He moved into a small, cheap rental apartment, furnishing it with second-hand items. He went back to work, pouring his grief and anger into his business. His crew saw a new fire in him, a harder edge they hadn't seen before. He played the part of the broken man perfectly. When mutual acquaintances called to offer their condolences, he sounded sad and defeated. The news that spread through their social circle was the one Isabella had crafted, that she had finally left her unambitious, boring husband to pursue a better life. She was the brave one, he was the pathetic one left behind. Meanwhile, Arthur's team was working silently in the background. Private investigators tracked Isabella and Julian's spending. It was, as Arthur had predicted, a spectacle of excess. They leased a penthouse apartment with panoramic city views. They bought a brand new Porsche for her and a ridiculously oversized SUV for him. They were photographed at the most expensive restaurants, Julian draped in designer clothes, Isabella dripping with new jewelry. They were living like lottery winners, burning through Alex's life savings with a desperate, frantic energy. Alex saw the photos online. He felt the sting of betrayal with every lavish purchase. But now the sting was accompanied by a cold sense of satisfaction. They were tightening the noose around their own necks. Finally, the day came. A courier delivered the divorce papers to Alex's worksite. He signed for them, his hand steady. He met with Arthur that afternoon. The documents were exactly as they had predicted. Isabella was demanding alimony, claiming she had been a supportive wife who had sacrificed her own career for his. She had declared a modest amount of assets, conveniently omitting the $500,000 she had taken from their account. It was a work of pure fiction. "It's time," Arthur said simply. He filed their response, a dry legal document that hinted at undisclosed assets and financial misconduct, setting the stage for the preliminary hearing. The day of the hearing arrived. Alex wore a simple, well-worn suit, looking every bit the humble contractor Isabella had always described him as. He saw her across the courthouse hallway. She was a vision in a sharp, expensive white suit, looking powerful and untouchable. Julian was with her, preening like a peacock in a gaudy designer jacket. When she saw Alex, she gave him a look of pure pity, a dismissive glance that said, "You don't belong here." She whispered something to her lawyer, a slick, overconfident man in a suit that probably cost more than Alex's rent for a year. They both chuckled. They took their places in the sterile courtroom. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Miller, called the case. Isabella's lawyer went first, painting a picture of his client as a long-suffering wife, trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who lacked drive and sophistication. He argued for a swift, no-fault divorce, with the current division of assets standing as it was, and a generous alimony package for Isabella. Then it was Arthur's turn. He stood up slowly, his age lending him an air of quiet authority. "Your Honor," he began, "we agree that this marriage is irretrievably broken. However, we strenuously object to the plaintiff's characterization of the facts, particularly concerning the division of marital assets." Isabella's lawyer scoffed. "Objection. There are no other assets to speak of." "On the contrary," Arthur said smoothly, "there are substantial assets, assets the plaintiff has conveniently failed to disclose in her financial affidavit, an asset she has actively sought to conceal from my client and this court." A murmur went through the room. Isabella shifted in her seat, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "First," Arthur said, placing a thick binder on the table, "let's address the matter of the joint savings account. On October 12th, 3 days before she abandoned the marital home, Ms. Valenti transferred the entire balance of that account, $487,000 to be precise, to a private account in her name only. An account Mr. Hayes had no knowledge of." He presented the bank statements. The judge's eyes narrowed as she looked them over. Isabella's lawyer leaned over and whispered furiously to her. Her face had gone pale. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation, "she has spent the last month dissipating these stolen marital assets with reckless abandon." He produced another binder, this one filled with photographs and credit card statements. "A lease on a $10,000 a month penthouse, a brand new Porsche Cayenne, a Rolex for her brother, Mr. Julian Croft. The list goes on." The judge's expression was now glacial. She looked from the evidence to Isabella, whose mask of cool superiority was beginning to crack. "This is outrageous," Isabella's lawyer blustered. "My client was simply securing her future." "By stealing her husband's life savings," Arthur cut in sharply. "Your Honor, this is a clear case of fraud, but this is not, in fact, the most significant financial element at play here." He paused for dramatic effect. The courtroom was silent. "My client, Mr. Hayes, has his own separate premarital assets, assets held in a trust established by his grandfather, assets my client, in his humility, never felt the need to flaunt." Arthur placed one final document on the table. It was the appraisal. "Your Honor, we are submitting into evidence an appraisal of the Thomas Hayes Heritage Trust. Its primary holdings are a collection of rare, classic automobiles. The total appraised value of this trust is $4,200,000. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Isabella's jaw dropped. She stared at Alex, her eyes wide with utter, uncomprehending shock. Julian looked like he had been struck by lightning. Alex met her gaze across the room. He held it, his expression calm, neutral, and unreadable. For the first time, she was seeing him, truly seeing him, and the man she saw was a complete stranger. Her lawyer was stammering, utterly blindsided. This is impossible, preposterous. We had no knowledge of any such trust." "Precisely," Arthur thundered, "because your client was so blinded by her own greed and her contempt for her husband, she failed to see what was right in front of her. She was so busy stealing his hard-earned savings, she threw away the key to a multi-million-dollar fortune." He held up the small, tarnished brass key for the whole court to see. "This, Your Honor, the key to the storage unit that houses part of the collection, the worthless junk she so magnanimously allowed my client to keep." The dam broke. "No!" Isabella shrieked, jumping to her feet. "No, he's lying! That's impossible! It was just a garage full of old junk!" Her voice was shrill, hysterical. The carefully constructed facade of the elegant, powerful woman had shattered, revealing the screeching, frantic avarice beneath. "Ms. Valenti, sit down," the judge commanded, banging her gavel. But Isabella was beyond reason. She pointed a trembling finger at Alex. You did this. You planned this. You made me look like a fool." Alex finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. "You made yourself look like a fool, Isabella?" He stood up to address the judge, but his eyes were locked on his wife. "For 10 years you treated me like I was nothing, like I was dirt on your shoe. You spent my money, you mocked my work, and you belittled me in front of everyone we knew. You thought I was simple, you thought I was weak." He took a step forward. "You spent a decade chasing wealth, but you have no concept of true value. My grandfather left me a legacy of passion, of hard work and beauty. You saw a dusty old storage unit. You saw junk, because that's all you're capable of seeing. You can only measure things in dollars, and even then, your judgment is pathetic." He gestured to the evidence. "You stole $500,000 from me, and in the process, you threw away your chance at a life you can't even imagine, all because of your own arrogance." "You threw away the key, Isabella," he said, his voice dropping to a cold, devastating whisper. "You had everything, and you threw it all away for a cheap thrill and a new car." Isabella stared at him, her face a mask of horror and dawning realization. The full scope of her catastrophic error was crashing down on her. The money, the status, the future, it was all gone, and she had handed the executioner the axe herself. She crumpled back into her chair, a choked sob escaping her lips. Julian was already inching away from her, his face pale with fear, realizing that the money train had not only stopped, it had derailed in a fiery crash. The judge had seen enough. Her voice was like ice. "Based on the evidence presented," she declared, "I am issuing an immediate injunction freezing all of Ms. Valenti's accounts. I am ordering a full forensic audit of her finances. I am also ordering her to return the Porsche Cayenne to the marital estate, pending the outcome of this case." "And Ms. Valenti," she added, her gaze withering, "I would advise you to find yourself a new lawyer, and perhaps a very good accountant." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed the sound of Isabella's world breaking apart. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Isabella's life imploded. With her accounts frozen and her credit destroyed, the penthouse, the cars, and the designer clothes all vanished. The story of her public humiliation spread like wildfire through her social circle, turning her into a pariah overnight. Julian, true to his nature, abandoned her the moment the money was gone, leaving her to face the legal storm alone. She was forced to move into a tiny, run-down apartment, the kind she would have sneered at just months before. The fraud investigation led to criminal charges. Faced with prison time, she accepted a plea deal that left her with a felony record, massive fines, and court-ordered restitution to Alex for every dollar she had stolen. Alex, on the other hand, found a quiet peace. He finalized the divorce, his terms being the only ones on the table. He didn't ask for much, only what was legally his: the house, the business, and the trust. He didn't sell the cars. His grandfather's words about value and passion had stuck with him. Instead, he used a portion of the collection's liquid value to expand his construction business and to set up a foundation in his grandfather's name, the Thomas Hayes Foundation for Artisans, providing scholarships and grants for young people wanting to learn skilled trades like cabinet making and mechanical restoration. He moved out of the city, buying a small parcel of land with a large workshop. He spent his evenings there, not in a dusty storage unit, but in a state-of-the-art facility, learning to care for the magnificent machines his grandfather had left him. He found a deep, satisfying joy in the work, in preserving the legacy. He was finally living a life of purpose, a life he defined for himself, One Saturday, while working on the fine-tuning of the Jaguar's engine, a local woman stopped by. Her car had broken down on the road nearby. Her name was Clara. She was an art teacher with kind eyes and a warm smile, and she was more fascinated by the intricate design of the engine than the car's monetary value. They talked for hours about art, about building things, about the stories objects can tell. For the first time in a very long time, Alex felt seen. He felt understood. He had learned a hard lesson. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or luxury goods. It's measured in integrity, in passion, and in the quiet dignity of a life well lived. Isabella had chased a glittering illusion, and it had led her to ruin. Alex, left with what she considered junk, had found a fortune far greater than money. He had found himself. And in the end, that was the greatest treasure of all.